the EscapeGoat podcast, a podcast series featuring the discussion of many different topics, flaws and all, based on personal whims and fascinations. Hosted by me, David Blake Fagiani, and several different guests. Hello, and welcome to the EscapeGoat podcast, episode 18. I think that's right. I think that's pretty right. And I'm really glad to welcome my friend Tierney Hamilton to the show. Hi, Tierney. How you doing?
Hello. Not great, Bob.
yeah, very succinct.
No, I can't complain. It wouldn't help anyway.
We'll see. I've asked Tierney on. I've been meaning to have Tierney on for a while, actually. I met Tierney through her sister Kat, who's been on the show formerly. I've known Tierney for several years now, and we do a lot of our interacting through an online Facebook group that discusses politics called Game of Seats, which where we normally kind of hit a tone somewhere in between serious discussion and shit posting, which is a nice comfort zone for us, I think. But I knew from the point of starting the show that not only would I want to have Tierney on to chat in general, but also that starting a podcast in 2020 as a political nerd, there was a clear looming extinction level event coming over the horizon. So it was obviously going to be centered on that. I'm talking, of course, about the US presidential election, which is, as of now, only less than 2 weeks away.
Might even be less than 10 days.
Yeah, it's the 24th of October 2020 we're recording this on. So yeah, it's in the middle of next week, basically, isn't it? Or the week after next.
Yeah, it'll be week from Tuesday. So about 10 days.
Good times.
Yep.
I just like to, before we get into that, obviously, I'd just like you to introduce yourself to the listeners, Tierney. Tell us a little bit about who you are, where you're from, where you've lived in recent years, and where you're talking to me now from.
Aside from being the deadbeat American admin on Game of Seats, it's been harder to do since Trump was elected, because things became less sort of horse race and fun and more of an existential threat. But I work primarily in the arts. I've worked at a lot of nonprofits and museums, and what I'm really interested in is public engagement and seeing how we can leverage certain popular types of artwork to utilize greater engagement. And I am doing that work currently as a PhD student at the University of Rochester here in upstate New York. Came out here from California, and everyone was like, "Why? Did they tell you about the weather?" And I said, it's like nothing but Starks up here. I hear nothing but winter is coming.
Yeah.
All the time. All the time.
And of course, you did that move this year, didn't you? After the COVID outbreak.
Yes, and it was a tough call. In hindsight, we probably could have flown just as safely, in finger quotes, as we drove. But the university was very weird about it. They were basically like, yes, you can attend all remote classes, but you have to attend remotely from Rochester. So I was like, okay. So we packed everything up and drove across the country in 3.5 days. Wow. I don't recommend it.
That in itself must have been quite a strange experience to do in an election year, going coast to coast across America, and having a look, however transitorily, and seeing kind of a big swathe of it.
Well, the really interesting thing was we, at a certain point, we got into the habit of every time we'd cross a state line, we'd pull up the Wikipedia article for that state and then just sort of like read the overview. And there are a couple states that should be ashamed of themselves. I'm looking at you, Illinois. I thought you were better than that. Jesus.
Well, in terms of what? I think if we're going to throw out accusations like that, you have to be slightly more specific.
Primarily, so I think it probably just depends upon, are you going north or are you going south? And since we went a more northern route, we basically went Nevada, Utah, Wyoming, Nebraska. Then we went Nebraska into Iowa, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Pennsylvania, I think, and then New York. And now I'm going to look at a map of my own country and be embarrassed that I missed something.
Well, you just named a lot of swing states, though.
Yeah, and I can kind of see why the contingent of folks on the right is a lot stronger than I would have thought. But again, okay, yeah, I think I did. No, I got Indiana and Ohio mixed up. I'm so sorry. So, but yeah, I mean, when you're going through these states and when you're looking over their history, it's pretty much just a country built on dead Indians. That's just what it is.
Yeah, I heard a bit about that.
Yeah, well, they do actually a pretty lousy job of teaching us about it, which is unfortunate. I mean, maybe it's changed since I was in school, but I really felt like we kind of glazed over all that, and especially in high school when you're supposed to be doing these things more in depth, they decided to keep it more modern. So we kind of started at like World War I and up, but they never really talked about like, Woodrow Wilson's extreme, white supremacist views.
Well, I watched Disney's Pocahontas, so I assume I got the gist, right? That's about it.
Yeah, pretty much. Give or take. Yeah, it was. There were many good people on both sides.
I was just about to make that joke as well.
Yeah. No. But that's Illinois. I can't remember the specifics right now because, as I told you, I'm having some like terrible insomnia right now. I don't know why. It's not like things are stressful. I think I told you, like, I had to turn off the debate because I was gritting my jaw so hard I thought I was going to break a molar. But I would encourage anybody to just go to Wikipedia and look up quick history of Illinois because it was a lot darker than I thought it was going to be. So and yeah, Wyoming was another state that was interesting on that front. And the first place I'd ever driven in my life where I was like, there's too much sky here. This is not the correct ratio.
Yeah, for an American, that must be quite a high bar that you have to pass to have that worry.
It's actually very disorienting, but yeah, it's you realize that there's a lot of space, which I actually think is a good thing. Nebraska, anyone could give a miss. Just no reason to go to Nebraska. It was like totally uninteresting until we got to oh gosh, where were we? Now I've got to look at a map.
It'd be funny if the first hate mail I got for this podcast was Nebraska listeners now, just after you saying that.
Yeah.
The views of Tierney do not necessarily represent the views of the podcast.
Well, until we got to Omaha, and Omaha was cool. Everyone said like, oh, Iowa's gonna be totally boring. I found Iowa to be beautiful, sort of bucolic farmland and rolling hills of corn, whereas Nebraska was flat fields of corn, and a lot of people resistant to wearing masks. But anyway, that is to say that, yeah, we did a very, very short run across the United States, and I would not recommend. I see. Unless if you can like take some time, enjoy yourself, maybe do a bike tour. That would be a great way to see the U.S. But at 12 hours a day at 70 miles an hour, I don't recommend. I
do appreciate you moving several hours closer to the UK just for the ease of doing this podcast. That's helped a lot with the scheduling. Thank you. Very thoughtful. I just want to say, you just said to me off the air before we started recording that despite now living on the East Coast of the States, you're still voting in California, right? You're doing an absentee ballot this year.
Yes. So, and actually it turned out to be a little complicated. And the reason that I have a spare ballot is that, and actually I'm not sure how to properly dispose of that. I need to look into that. Maybe I'll just keep it forever.
Just give it to your local Republican ballot box, run ballot box. I think that's how it's being done right now, I think.
So basically in order for us to establish residency in New York, we would have needed to like go to the DMV, do this, do that. And there really wasn't enough time for us to get a residency established and then get registered to vote that we would be able to vote at all. So we called the elections board in our county, back in California, Contra Costa County, and I explained the situation to them because I had found that our registration had been made inactive, and I was like, what? So I explained to them the situation. I said, I'm a student, we just moved here, we haven't established residency yet, blah, blah, blah. And they said, okay, yeah, well, no, we'll make you active again. We made you inactive because you changed your mailing address. Zach and I still own that house. We just have tenants in there. But yeah, basically the Board of Elections there was really, really great about it. But I think what ended up happening was I panicked when I saw we were inactive and I registered again. And I think that's why they sent us 2 ballots. So we sent back 1. We called the Board of Elections to be like, we got 2. What do we do? And again, I feel like they're handling things really well. We have, there's a website called Ballot Tracks, so we can actually track our ballot and see where it is and whether it's been accepted. And And California has been doing a lot of mail-in voting for a long time. It's a lot better set up for this than other states are. You can ask to be an absentee voter because you feel like it.
Yeah.
Effectively. Zach and I opted to. Zach is the person I am married to. We opted to continue to go to our polling place because we actually kind of like the communal feeling of it, and it was really close to our house.
Yeah, I like doing that too. I enjoy that.
It's nice, and it's like walking distance from our house. So it was like this nice thing where we'd walk to the school where they were doing it, and then we'd walk home. And he and I actually try to do every single election. I don't know that we've missed one since we moved to that address. Now we've moved away.
The California address that you're voting at, obviously California as a state has been, safely blue for the last few decades. The actual congressional district where you vote, is that a competitive one, or is that?
Nope.
Well, in the blue direction, I guess.
Yeah, no, it's not competitive at all. The ones that are mostly in Southern California, where there is a longer tradition of Republicanism, particularly in Orange County and Santa Clarita, which people will know as, actually, this is very handy. Orange County is where Disneyland is. Santa Clarita is where Six Flags Magic Mountain is. So, yeah, it's, so Orange County, it looks a lot more purple than it used to. Santa Clarita, I think, did as well. Although there was a new congresswoman from Santa Clarita who got in hot water because she and her husband were polyamorous, and there was a relationship with one of her staffers, I believe, that was deemed to be inappropriate. So I think she resigned. I'm not sure what happened after that. I just don't follow that particular congressional district.
Some of our British listeners, even the ones who are kind of political nerds, which is presumably most of the people listening to this podcast, might not be aware that you guys elect your Congress, the nearest thing to your Parliament, your lower house, your entire Congress every 2 years. Yeah,
the idea for the founders was that the House was supposed to be sort of fast and furious. We elect them every 2 years, and it's much larger. And then the Senate, I think the phrase or the trope around that goes that the Senate was supposed to be sort of like the saucer that cooled the coffee from the House, that they were supposed to be more serious and more deliberative.
It's certainly been cooling the fuck out of the coffee recently.
Oh my God. Yeah, the biggest issue is so that the Senate is controlled by whoever's in the majority. So because there's a Republican majority in the Senate right now, Mitch McConnell is the Senate leader. If the Democrats take the Senate, as they, I believe, are slightly favored to do, just barely, then Chuck Schumer, who is the one of the senators from the great state of New York, will be the leader of the Senate, and he will then be in charge of deciding what gets voted on and what does not.
I think one of the things that British people find confusing about American politics is that outside of a presidential campaign, which we'll move on to in a second, you guys don't really have what we'd call like leaders of the parties, as in a sense. You don't really have a leader of the opposition, so to speak. You have these powerful figures in Congress, these powerful figures in the Senate who may be, as they currently are, from different parties, and then you obviously have a presidential candidate who tends to dominate the news cycle for the sort of 1.5 years that they're prominent, basically. But there's not really such a thing as party unity in a way, and there's not really. I mean, there are attempts to harness it in Congress and obviously towards specific bills and things, but there's not really an idea of a party line and of a leader who's outside that presidential campaign, of a leader who's taking you in a particular direction. I thought about that because I was watching one of the debates the other day, and I think Trump accused Biden of being like, well, not accused him, but he said, you are the leader of the Democratic Party, and you should think these things, or you should impose these beliefs. And I was like, he's not actually, though, is he? Like, that doesn't exist, really.
Well, that is sort of the way we handle it, which is, whoever wins the presidential nomination is the de facto leader of the party. But my understanding, based on, I don't remember what or where I heard it, but my understanding is that the founders are actually kind of resistant to parties, and they didn't necessarily want it to look like a parliamentary system.
The fact that you've referred to the founders rather than the founding fathers means that it makes it sound very likely you live in the Dominion from Star Trek.
I was about to say they are gelatinous
in their infinite wisdom.
I'm resistant to the idea of like founding fathers, just because I don't know. I really like that really does just like reinstill the idea of patriarchy so much. It's just a very uncomfortable way to think about it.
Did you see Hamilton?
I did, and it was very enjoyable. I watched it on Disney. I never got a chance to see it live, but it was great. And it's a very glossy interpretation still. I mean, even though it has these aspirations toward racial justice, it's still like extremely kind to the founding fathers who were slaveholders. And the idea that Sally Hemings is kind of a punchline in that musical is kind of horrible, because she was a teenager who was raped by somebody who owned her.
Yeah, it's wildly inappropriate, I would say, that bit.
Yeah, and I'm not, obviously I wasn't there, thankfully, but I take the attitude that like if somebody owns you, it's really hard to consent. So
I think that's fair.
That's don't at me, as the kids say these days. That's my read on it.
One of the things I found most interesting about Hamilton, and that's most relevant to our conversation today, is that it has obviously a lot in it. You talk about parties not being, political parties not being in the Constitution, etc. Obviously, one thing Hamilton portrays is the kind of emergence of political parties as the kind of as the 18th century becomes the 19th century, and kind of the dramatic election of 1800, where you get some of the conventions, well, almost like the early conventions of the United States breaking down, like, things like the second place presidential candidate becoming the vice president automatically, things like that just sound really bizarre to anyone who's used to modern electoral politics, the sort of system where if it had pertained, we would have had Hillary now as the vice president,
Absolutely. Yeah. Which is really weird. So, I mean, in some ways I can see how that would sort of encourage more people to be a little bit more accommodating. But people far smarter than I am about this seem to think that one of the reasons that we've become more partisan is because of the way our primary system works, which is that people are going to select the more extreme candidate because the people who would show up to a primary are inherently more partisan. They are more invested. And that would be one reason why there's not as much impetus for folks to work together anymore. And then additionally, broadly, I'm somebody who is of the belief that the rise of Murdoch-owned right-wing media has created or has aided in creating these like two separate realities. Because just to sort of like take the temperature, I guess, I'll sort of see like, all right, what's front page on the New York Times, San Francisco Chronicle, any Washington Post, any of the papers that I try to read from time to time, and then I'll literally just go to foxnews.com, and it'll inevitably be like something huge and earth-shattering has happened, but for them it's just like top 10 Christmas decorations. I mean, it'll be like totally different. And they may well have addressed the same story, but it's very much below the fold. And I think that there's also, and this is where my particular training in visual culture comes in, I think that there is a huge problem with the opinion shows because they have all of the trappings of a newscaster. And I think that there's a problem there, which is that if something looks like news, you're going to think of it that way, even though it's opinion. And there have even been like multiple lawsuits where Fox News has defended themselves by saying, well, no reasonable person would take any of these personalities seriously, which is incredible because they do. Yeah,
we've got that creeping into broadcast media in Britain. Obviously, we've never been free of bias and opinion in the media, but our TV broadcasting, at least assumedly, has had this kind of attempted neutrality. Whereas now with the rise of particularly Piers Morgan and the stuff he's been doing with ITV, which is kind of designed to inflame and provoke and to be shared on the internet, etc. We're tiptoeing, particularly with our current Conservative government, who some of them would like the media to move more in that kind of direction, with kind of sanctioned, but bias, legitimately biased, you might say, sources on different sides. It looks like we might be getting a much heftier dose of that in the near future.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to have worked pretty well here. So I think anybody would be a fool not to. Anybody who has, I should say, those intentions would be a fool not to look at the American example and see what's worked. I think also The just to give a little more background to how this relates now, Silicon Valley is extremely laissez-faire libertarian.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea in the internet in its infancy, the idea was that, that there would be this free marketplace, free market of ideas, and the best stuff would rise to the top and the rest would all fall away. But what's happened is, as we're constantly being asked to make these decisions which establish our taste, in effect, we are asked to like or dislike something. What we've ended up with is the stuff that gets shared the most is the stuff that's enraging. That's the stuff that engages us. So we've ended up, in this place where it's sort of like our darkest inclinations is what's being spread, because the other stuff it's boring. I mean, like, why would you bother reacting to that? Or spreading anything unless you sort of wanted to loop everyone else into your righteous indignation. So I think that's been a huge issue too. And for anybody who's concerned about the really fringe stuff like QAnon, I would highly recommend the podcast Reply All. They did an episode on QAnon recently. And if you're somebody who's spent time on any of the chans, like, that it's just like total garbage. But if you're not familiar, I would highly recommend. I forget which episode it is, but they did do a QAnon episode, which was illuminating.
You send me a link to that. I'll put it in the show notes. I'm sure some of our listeners will want to hear that.
Yeah, sure.
I was just going to... We kind of... There's loads of stuff I could get into off the back of that, but I'm just becoming aware, Tierney, that before we start talking about the presidential campaign itself in a sec, I haven't really asked you about your kind of recent political background. So would you like to just tell the listeners a little bit about kind of where you're coming from politically, and like maybe particularly since the last presidential election cycle, but just in the last 10 years in general?
Sure. I would consider myself somebody who's been slowly radicalized.
Haven't we all?
No, yeah. No, I mean, I would say that I've gone a lot further left on a lot of things. I think that there was, particularly given the people I was hanging out with at the time and sort of my political awakening, is I definitely leaned very Democrat, but I think I consider myself something of what I heard pejoratively referred to as a South Park moderate, which was, this idea that it's, things are basically ridiculous. Things are sort of built on meritocracy. Political correctness is silly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And those are all, ideas that come from a place of privilege. It's easy to be like, well, people just need to calm down about this, and that, when you're somebody who can't possibly be hurt by any of it. And
part of the reason we refer to that as South Park politics or South Park republicanism or moderation is that politics comes, and I'm not saying this to denigrate every aspect of it, but that politics comes very easily out of an adolescent worldview, doesn't it, or a pre-adolescent worldview? The cynicism, I mean. Yeah, I'd say so. But it was also I was also somebody who didn't realize which systems I benefited from. So for example, I was somebody who, when I was younger, was like, well, I don't really need feminism. Like, that's not, I don't know, that seems like very antagonistic, and, it's not necessary. And, of course, that's just because I was benefiting, from everybody to come before me, and my unique place of privilege, having grown up, upper middle class and white in a wealthy state, with easy access to anything I needed. Something like socialized medicine was never something I had to think about, because I always had access to healthcare until I didn't. Right before the Affordable Care Act went into effect, I got duped by an insurance scheme, effectively, right,
where I paid. I had left a job that paid for my health insurance. I was too old to be on my parents anymore. And because I had a pre-existing condition, I was totally unable to find coverage with anybody. And then finally got a hold of somebody who did offer me coverage, but it was essentially like a junk policy. I ended up having to go to the emergency room, only to find that it covered nothing. Mm-hmm. So I'd been paying something like, oh gosh, I don't know, at least $150 a month, which actually isn't that much given how much private insurance can cost. But I was paying $150 a month over the course of 6 months at least for something that covered literally nothing. And it was just by pure fortune that that my family was able to help me pay those bills from the hospital. It would have been devastating otherwise. So those are the sorts of things that until you experience them, particularly in the U.S., you have really no concept of what it would look like otherwise. So when the Affordable Care Act came into play, I was somebody who benefited from that. And I mean, like a lot of people did. And that certainly changed my thinking about what public medicine could and should be. Additionally, I've strayed pretty hard left on the Second Amendment. I am unapologetic about my feeling that it should be abolished. I mean, it's just like, it's
could you remind us which amendment that is, please?
Sure. The Second Amendment is the right to let's see, I'll read the exact text from it, because actually it's a weird and vague amendment, and it's only because of certain Supreme Court rulings that we think of it as an individual right to bear arms. There's still a lot of contention as to whether or not it was ever actually intended that way. And furthermore, I learned recently that the militias that they refer to in the Constitution, and that, these dipshits, wherever they are, Michigan, these militias planning to kidnap the governor, they were actually what later became the National Guard. So so the way it works here is that each state effectively has sort of a local division of the army that's particular to that state. And then, of course, if the whole country, there's a national standing army, and then these, the Army National Guard for each state. And if we go to war, the National Guard in each state will be called up to join the effort.
I see. So the National Guard is in effect not a National Guard. It is 50 National Guards. Is that right?
Yeah. Exactly. So yeah, it's called the Army National Guard, and it would be specific to each state. So my understanding, and I literally learned this like a couple days ago, was that these initially, these militias were actually really unpopular. But the idea was that there'd be a standing national army, militias for each state, and then when militias when we went to war, when like Canada was a threat to us, because it was. Those militias would be called up to serve with the standing national army, and that later became the Army National Guard. So the idea that people are sort of like forming there, and they weren't popular, like nobody really liked them, apparently. Again, just learned this, could be totally wrong. I was accused the other day in a class of being too anecdotal in my references, and I'm very self-conscious about it.
No, this is a very safe space for that kind of approach to things.
So that's some background to this. But the exact text of the Second Amendment is a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So, it's for some people super clear. For others, it's not. I certainly read it in the context of these historical militias. And my understanding is that the individual right to bear arms was not established until well into the 20th century. And that's the Supreme Court precedent that we've been working with ever since. It was interesting to me when I was living in Japan last summer. I talked to a lot of people, and they said it was we were in the midst of a rash of terrible, terrible mass shootings, including one that happened at literally a garlic festival, not far from where I lived. And so it really hit close to home. It was tragic. I was just like, who would show up to like this garlic festival to kill people? And I remember talking to a couple people at the language school I was at, and I said, like, what do you think when you see this? And they were like, we are so confused. They were, Japanese people are extremely polite, as they are reputed to be. And what I basically got was the kindest version of, we just don't understand why you can't get your shit together on this. Yeah,
well, I mean, this is a slight simplification, as most of these assertions tend to be, but in the UK, famously, we always had for most of modern history, we've had tighter gun laws than even the most draconian US states, but in the late 90s, when I was about 11, we had a famous shooting called the Dunblane Massacre in Scotland, where a guy shot up a primary school and killed a lot of people. And that basically, it's a bit of a simplification, but that basically meant that not overnight, but within a year, a lot of handguns were outlawed over, very, very quickly. A lot of, it's a bit of a simplification to say we had one school shooting and then solved it, but we kind of did.
Yeah, it was incredible to me that we had multiple school shootings. I was in middle school, I think, when the Columbine shooting happened, and that was by no means the first school shooting, but it was certainly one of the most in a very like literal sense. It was a spectacle. And so I think that really stuck in the imagination. But the fact of the matter is that we have such a powerful gun lobby here that there's just no way without some serious changes that's going to change. And even the subsequent school shootings after that, literal first graders were murdered. And what happened was that people on the extreme far right fringe started throwing up accusations that it was fake, that it didn't happen, which is just it's a level of wickedness and cruelty that I can barely wrap my head around, because these are families who lost very young children, and then there are people who were like, well, maybe they were actors. Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
How deluded do you have to be?
It's interesting that for my entire kind of even like childhood and adolescent and certainly adult political lifetime, the British left has tended to look at the US as a kind of source of a lot of things to demonize and castigate. I'm thinking about everything from health care to lack of gun control, whereas the British right and certainly the part of it that's in the ascendancy at the moment is the sort of libertarian Randian right it has tended to look at the US and generally admired what they see there, at least the way things have gone in the last few decades.
It just seems to me that there's certainly things to admire. There's some really positive things that have happened here, but we're talking about a country that still has colonies, and we're like, well, they're territories, and it's like, no, what like, you can't honestly say that about Puerto Rico. You can't seriously look at Puerto Rico and the fact that they have no representation in Congress and say like, well, but we're not an imperial force. Yeah,
and let's not start talking about Washington D.C. either.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things that's being floated, and I hope that they do seriously consider, just in consideration of fairness to the people who live there, is one of the sort of threats that folks on the right are throwing up is if you elect Joe Biden and we have a majority in the Senate, they'll end the filibuster, they'll make Puerto Rico and Washington D.C. states, and then we'll have more than likely two or four more Democrats in the Senate. And when it was established that Washington D.C. would not be represented, the idea was that because the government was there, you didn't want the people in D.C. making all of their laws, to their own benefit. But the fact of the matter is that the representatives don't live there full time. I mean, it might have made sense if it took you 3 months on horseback to get from like your home to Washington. But in a day and age where we have air travel, and a lot of the representatives don't live there much of the year, I just don't feel like there's, and when DC is not is a city that's not like nothing, it's not inhabited entirely by government officials.
No, it's not a sort of Vatican. It's not a sort of federal Vatican,
Exactly. So that's one reason why it just doesn't make sense that they don't have any representation.
Yeah.
And then the same for Puerto Rico, where they're American citizens. So, I mean, like, that's literally my argument.
Yeah.
For Puerto Rico.
Yeah. Well, Puerto Rico, I've been following the Puerto Rican sort of statehood movement for a while now, and that's one of those things where I literally could see Puerto Rico becoming a state in like 5 years. I could also see it taking another 45 years, or I could see it taking my whole lifetime, basically.
Yeah. If the and here's me, doing actual punditry. If the Democrats can grow a pair, either ovaries or testicles.
You'd settle for either or both at the moment,
Yeah. If they would just, to put it in Letterkenny terms, give their balls a tug and, be willing to take risks, end the filibuster, bring on DC and Puerto Rico as states, it would certainly put us in in a far better position. But, that all depends upon whether or not the Democrats take the Senate, whether or not we have a Democratic president, and then whether or not they're willing to blow their political capital.
Yeah, I was going to say, and also Biden's not really running on a wildly reformist platform, is he? I mean, he's running on a safe pair of hands. We'll talk about this more after the break when we talk about the campaigns properly. But he's largely running on a safe pair of hands, back to sanity. I know there's a lot of like big financial, industrial, environmental stuff being talked about. But in terms of political reform, there's nothing really there, is there?
Yeah, it's incredible that anybody on the right's trying to cast him as like Che Guevara. He's so moderate. He's so moderate and always has been. And that's one of the things that's most incredible to me is they're just like, Joe Biden is a puppet of the left. Just like the whole reason that Obama picked him for Veep in 2008, my understanding is because he was supposed to appeal to the middle. So,
although I suppose that you could generously say to some Republican commentators that it's possible to be an unwilling puppet of the left. You can still be propped up by something you don't necessarily passionately believe in.
I suppose so. I find it. I'm incredulous about how actually left wing any of it's gonna go. But the most interesting thing is how terrified people seem to be of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Yeah, I saw. Trump brought her up by her initials in the last debate. I saw.
It's just incredible that they bring her up as this boogeyman all the time because she's just like it's just amazing to me that she's so threatening to them. Or I'd say that speaks volumes that anybody would look at her and not be like, wow, there's like a really confident, intelligent woman who has this she has this sort of American narrative that we all like to see. This idea that she worked hard and based on her merits she accelerated to the halls of Congress. But instead what you hear is it's like, oh, she was just a bartender. She's a former bartender who's coming to destroy your way of life is the narrative that you hear, which is just like, it's bizarre. They really like to have it both ways, where she's like incompetent and unqualified, but also terrifying.
Yeah, well, probably don't. I know it'll play well with certain parts of the Republican base, but probably don't remind your audience all the time that your opponents have a young, attractive, very articulate, witty, camera-friendly, social media-friendly person who clearly looks like part of the future of the party. Maybe just don't keep rubbing that in.
Yeah, it's the whole thing is incredible, and also just to. Any of that new generation of Congress that came in, and not like literal generation, because I think that oh gosh, I'm so embarrassed, I'm blanking on her name. There were two Native American women who were started in the House at the same time, and I believe they're a little bit older than Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is, but yeah, sort of this new. Yeah, I'm thinking of a new generation in terms of their political leanings being more similar.
It's a new left caucus, isn't it? It's a heavily Sanders influenced left caucus in the Democratic Party.
Yeah, and it's hilarious to me also that Bernie Sanders is the person who inspired like so many more women of color, and so many more folks on the LGBTQ spectrum to get involved was from an old white Jewish guy.
Well, if we're talking about old white guys who've been sitting in semi-obscurity for decades, re-inspiring and reigniting parts of the left, the UK's not had any similar experience of that recently. It's.
I actually know very little about Corbyn, except that he was sort of thought to be the British equivalent of Bernie Sanders, but we're so caught up in our own garbage here that it's easy to become myopic. Also because American politics dominates so much of what happens in the rest of the world, it's easy to just be thinking only about American politics.
Well, probably the most pertinent similarity at the moment in terms of British politics, definitely not time to get into this now, but is that the kind of the Corbynite wing of the Labour Party, you might say Corbyn and his fellow former leaders of the Labour Party have kind of been put back into their box somewhat, but they have inspired a caucus, especially of the more recently elected MPs. So there is something of a more organised left-wing socialist faction emerging in the Labour Party at the moment, which I think we're probably going to see quite a lot of fireworks with that over the next few years.
Has anybody thought to call that the Corbynite maneuver?
I surely. The problem there is the Corbynite maneuver is a bluff, so we might not want to draw attention to that as the left.
And also I feel like that might be kind of a deep cut. I don't know how many people are paying attention to original Star Trek episode titles.
No, we should just start putting the Balok puppet up during Prime Minister's question time. As the...
I am in favor of using the Balok puppet, basically just replacing everybody on MSNBC with
the Balok puppet. Perfect. You know what? I promise we are about to get into discussing the actual US presidential election, because we have been dancing around this a little bit. Yep. Let's take a little short break, and then we'll come back and we'll talk a bit about how the campaign's been going and our thoughts on it.
And we will begin with the fight against the coronavirus. President Trump, the first question is for you.
More and more people are getting better. We have a problem that's a worldwide problem. This is a worldwide problem. It will go away. And as I say, we're rounding the turn. We're rounding the corner. It's going away.
220,000 Americans dead. If you hear nothing else I say tonight, hear this. Anyone who's responsible for that many deaths should not remain as President of the United States of America.
I am the least racist person. I can't even see the audience because it's so dark, but I don't care who's in the audience. I'm the least racist person in this room.
Abraham Lincoln here is one of the most racist presidents we've had in modern history. He pours fuel on every single racist fire, every single one.
Success is going to bring us together. We are on the road to success. If he gets in, you will have a depression, the likes of which you've never seen. Your 401ks will go to hell, and it'll be a very, very sad day for this country.
What is on the ballot here is the character of this country. Decency, honor, respect, treating people with dignity, making sure that everyone has an even chance. And I'm going to make sure you get that.
Welcome back. And after that sort of general discussion of US politics and our political positioning and hopes and fears, I just want to talk to Tierney a little bit more about how the US presidential election, especially in recent weeks, has actually been going. Because for people listening to this, God knows if you will be, but down the line, as I say, week and a half out from the US presidential election 2020, what looks like is happening from an aggregate of polls is that Biden is going to win, because most pollsters, both on a national, popular vote level and in most key swing states, although we'll get back to that, look like they have fairly sizable Biden leads and, could translate, into continued Democratic control of the House, possible Democratic capture of the Senate, as Tierney's hinted, and, a thumping electoral college majority for a Biden presidency. Will that happen? I don't know. But I just thought we'd look at the two presidential campaigns briefly and talk about them, because we'd originally scheduled this to coincide with the end of the presidential debates, and we kind of have as well, although they didn't exactly go according to plan. No. No, I mean, the middle one didn't really happen at all and was replaced by two separate town halls. Focusing on Trump first, because it's very hard to contain this as it is to contain the man himself, into any sort of format. But how do you think, because obviously COVID broke internationally, earlier this year, and that's generally been credited as turning the Trump re-election campaign from a really good chance of something of happening and maintaining power into a bit of a long shot now.
Yeah, sort of.
How do you think? We'll see. How do you think Trump's? I suppose the easiest way I can put this is: do you think Trump's had a plan for this re-election campaign? How well do you think he's pivoted to a new plan, and how well do you think it's gone?
It's hard to distinguish. In both him and in the campaign, it's hard to distinguish planning from button mashing. Like I feel like that's what I see a lot of the time, because when people inevitably leave the White House and they have their tell-alls that they get these huge advances for, there is inevitably a description of like total chaos and nobody really knowing what to do. And it seems to me that based on everything that I've seen and heard, that it looks like they have some sense of what they want to achieve, and they're very clear on how to put those interests first. So, you know, the people who are in charge of, you know, the various agencies tend to be former lobbyists or former executives from the industries that are supposed to be regulated, or they are people who were friendlier to business interests and less serious, either like policy people or scientists. I mean, for example, making Rick Perry the secretary of the Department of Energy was like bizarre. He was the former governor of Texas, which, you know, means that he's good at leading large organizations, or that he has experience doing it. I can't speak to his particular performance in Texas, but, you know, this is a role that was previously occupied by Nobel winning physicists, and I believe that he has a bachelor's degree in animal husbandry. Right. I think. I don't even know if he's still the secretary there, but there were rumors flying around that he didn't actually understand that the Department of Energy is basically responsible for maintaining our nuclear arsenal.
Wow.
Yeah. And then that's sort of who they slap in there. Ben Carson, former neurosurgeon, in charge of HUD, makes very little sense to me, because, you know, it's not like he's even a developer. He's or somebody who works in housing policy. He's a former neurosurgeon and former presidential candidate. Yeah. And so it's very unclear to me why they felt like he would be a good fit. And that's where I look at sort of Trump world, and I see sort of flailing and button mashing. But that said, the people who end up in those positions have been very active about changing regulations in ways that benefit those businesses. You know, we had this massive tax cut, which on the face of it was supposed to be, you know, sort of good for everybody, but turned out to be very friendly to business. And depending upon who you were, that actually really hurt you. Zach and I ended up in terrible shape after the Republican tax cuts. We ended up owing, I mean, just a tremendous amount of money. And part of that was that they changed the worksheet that you use for calculating your paycheck withholding. So it looked like you were getting paid more money, but then on the back end, we found out that we owed all this money because we weren't withholding enough. And
I see. So you're actually an example of a sort of anecdotal example of how the Trump tax cuts actually, you know, materially have hurt some people.
Yeah, and I think that's true for a lot of people who live in so-called blue states, which tend to be wealthier. And I believe that there were certain tax credits and so forth that we were, and deductions that we were able to take advantage of because of the amount that we were paying within our respective states. California is a high tax state, New York, New Jersey, places like that. And I believe that when we lost the ability to take those deductions, that affected a lot of people. So a lot of people benefited, but then there were people like me who got like totally screwed.
When you talk to, I'm not asking you to, you know, name names here, but when you talk to, you know, perhaps like relatives, friends, you know, maybe particularly the older generation of people, you know, who might actually quite like Trump and might think he's either an appealing personality or a good avatar for their sort of political aspirations, or you know, at least a good prompter of their fears. What do they like about him? You know, what's, because I think it's important to focus on, you know, I mean, this guy at least has a fighting chance of being being the president again.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
You know, yeah. Why is he popular? Why do people who like him like him?
Well, what you hear a lot is that there's sort of that broadly, well, he's not a typical politician. He's a straight shooter. He's good for the economy. Are sort of it's frustrating because, you know, one of the political podcasts I listened to, Left, Right, and Center, which is produced by a Southern California public radio station called KCRW. They have, you know, the whole basis of the show is to bring on someone from the left, and then the host is a moderate, and then they bring in someone from the right. And the people they bring in from the right really bend over backwards to try to make certain defenses for Trump. But there are so few really serious political minds that can make any real, any serious assessments for why he's positive. And the best argument I've heard is that if you are pro-life, then you're pro-gun, then you want somebody like him in place to be making court picks, which he has. The federal court system is now flooded with conservative judges.
An undeniably successful part of their legacy. Yep. Whatever happens now,
and and that's regardless of the current Supreme Court vacancy, regardless of what happens with Amy Coney Barrett, the entire judicial system is flooded with conservative judges now. So if that is your goal, then that's positive. And then, of course, if you are somebody who is wealthy and you're somebody who's heavily invested in the stock market, then sort of the nitrous that the stock market was injected with, following those tax cuts, you would have made a lot of money. And I think for a lot of people, their tax burden was reduced. And I feel like those are sort of the only real serious arguments you can make in favor. There are the more emotional ones. The nostalgia factor, people who have some idea of what things were like before and that they were so much better before, and the idea that he represents some kind of return to traditional values. More importantly, there are a lot of people who seem to be attracted to his veneer of success. I mean, we know that he's terribly in debt. He has run so many things into the ground. He is the epitome of failing up. And I think that regardless of what the reality is, and regardless of whether or not he came by any of it honestly, just those trappings of wealth and success are what people are attracted to. They see somebody like that and they go, oh, okay, like he must have done a good job.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think as someone who disagrees with almost every one of his political goals, I think I when I watch footage of him recently, where either the sort of sit-down interviews he's been giving occasionally, or at the last debate, which happened just 2 days ago, I was watching that and I was thinking he retains, I wouldn't quite go so far as to call it charm, for me anyway. I'm sure it works as charm for a lot of people, but he has still got this kind of ability to smirk about kind of the inner workings of establishment Washington and kind of make it not him that's doing that, right? I mean, at least for a lot of his supporters, he was able, I think, we'll get on to Biden in a bit, but I think his strongest moments in that debate, for example, were the ones where he's able to get Biden talking about not necessarily the more outlandish sort of QAnon, Hunter Biden, conspiracy stuff, but the legacy of the Obama administration, the legacy and weaknesses, almost undeniable weaknesses of the Obama administration and its lack of achievements in some areas. He's quite good at getting Biden onto that ground where he ends up defending that administration. And I think, I'll talk about this in a minute, but I think that's partly the weakness, a weakness of Biden as a candidate as well. But I think Trump's still got that. He's still got that way to get his opponents onto quicksand without them quite realizing it. It's,
when I see his sort of, I keep talking about button mashing, and I feel like that he's the same way when he speaks, because, he evokes a feeling rather than actually stating anything, because within the same sentence he'll contradict himself frequently. That's a feature, not a bug. And that I think is part of his appeal, is that people will see some truth in that something he said resonates with their worldview, regardless of whether or not it actually makes sense. Regardless of whether or not you're actually able to parse out any information from a thing he says, and regardless of whether or not it's true. But for me, I find sort of everything about him inherently abhorrent, because he reminds me of abusive personalities that I've been around in the past, in terms of, sort of sucking all the oxygen out of the room, talking over you, being snide, being crass. I think that probably is what eventually turned a lot of people off. But for some people, again, that's part of the appeal.
Well, not to reduce you to demographic, but there is some polling evidence that particularly female voters find that off-putting, isn't there? Especially recently.
Well, given that on the old political compass, I'm very libertarian left, and more so with time. I'm probably not a good case study because from the get-go I didn't like him, but a lot of white women did. Most white women did, which.
Literally a majority in the last election.
Yep. And which is kind of incredible, but only speaks to our ability to constantly vote against our own self-interest.
Well, we've all got a bit of that.
But yeah, it's been, and I think that probably people underestimated that for most people, the fiscally conservative policies of Republican administration are the fact of the matter is that they're boring. Like people like Paul Ryan are we allowed to swear on the podcast?
Yeah, I would.
Okay,
yeah.
no, he's a fucking snore, and John Boehner and the people who came before him, or before this current wave of very populist right wing folks, is that flavor of republicanism is not interesting to most people. So the right doubled down on social issues, but what we're finding now is that sort of brought out this very dangerous right wing populism that I think that people just assumed couldn't exist in the United States because we've never had a monarchy, because we've never had a truly authoritarian government. So I think that people don't really understand what that looks like necessarily.
Well, and all winning election propositions are coalitions of sorts, but there is a sense to which Trump, we don't have time to analyse Trumpism properly, obviously, but this figurehead has been bolted onto and has surfed a wave not only of the more outlandish white nationalism and Steve Bannon type foment, but also of the slightly longer running Tea Party wave, hasn't it? The more wide appeal populism of the early noughties, the early 2010s rather, which is a whole bunch of stuff is and the more traditional Republican stuff as well, because whatever the chaos of the Republican primary in 2016, they've pretty much they've got behind and used Trump for their own ends, as you say, with the sort of cabinet appointments, etc., and all the tax policies, and this stuff. He's a weird figure, Trump, isn't he? Because on one level you don't know whether... I certainly don't pity him, but because he's still extremely privileged and I think in many respects evil.
He's doing fine.
Yeah, he's fine. He's fine. But there is that thing of being this vehicle for all these other motives when you yourself don't appear to be a particularly overtly political person. He's not. Obviously he has his stances and he has his ideologies that are within him and of who he is. But it's.
I just don't know that he does. That's what's so confusing to me is that I don't look at him and say well, there's a small government Republican. I think that. And that's sort of what's sort of befuddling to me. The other thing is, I was talking about how sort of rhetorically he'll talk more about feelings rather than conveying information and frequently contradict himself. Is that I think that it becomes sort of a, he becomes sort of something that you can project your own feelings onto. Well,
I think he's good at tapping into that gut feeling of his potential voters as well, because I was watching again the debate the other night, and he was asked about Black Lives Matter and some of their actions that might be less respectable, should we say, in terms of middle class opinion. And he went right back to his own reaction. He was like, whether this is true or not. He said, well, the first time I'd heard of Black Lives Matter, I was watching the news, and they said this, anti-police stuff, about pigs in blanket, and I felt terrible. I thought this is awful, and he goes straight back to his own gut reaction.
Yeah.
Again, whether that ever happened or not, I don't know, but that's how he presents it.
It's just, I'm so far off of that opinion, or I'm just so far off of, I think, probably what would even be considered the middle on that in particular. And I will preface this by saying that, when you've grown up the way I have in the country that I did, I am still spending a lot of time actively deprogramming, my own unconscious bias, and still working on learning how to better engage with racial justice, and working on learning how to be a good ally, and I probably always will be, because it's a kind of deprogramming that's very difficult to do. But here in Rochester, we've had a significant protest movement following the death of one Daniel Prude, and it's awful. And the long and short of it is that this is a man who was having a mental health episode, and basically was suffocated on a freezing night with a bag over his head, to greatly simplify what happened. But worse so was that it was the midst of COVID, so he was, when he lost consciousness, he was taken to the hospital. He was put on life support. A week later, he was pulled off life support, and his family was not involved on like any level, and it took them many months to find out what had happened. And they went to the media with the truth about how he died, and we had there was a huge protest backlash, but it was like the worst thing that happened here. And if you follow like Twitter or Nextdoor or any of the other social networks that were concerned with it, the interpretation of what was going on was like so bonkers. The worst thing that happened were twofold. And I would like to point out also that this was the longtime home of Frederick Douglass. His former house is like 2 blocks from me.
Right.
So, very, very important in terms of the abolition movement. So the craziest things that happened here were there were some diners downtown who got basically chased away from their tables. And I believe that they burned a bus stop. And yes, that bus stop had a family. It was 2 days from retirement. But no, I mean, it's like, it just, this whole argument all of this tension really over these protests really exemplified the way that our power structures are built to value property over the lives of Black people. And that was sort of what everybody was worrying about, was like, what about the businesses? What about the businesses? What about this? What about that? And, to my mind, I'm just like, yeah, it sucks. It's unfortunate, but, you could rebuild a business. You can't take back dead.
Yeah, well, quite. Well, on that note, let's turn to the Biden campaign a little bit, because, we don't have that much time, but if two things have sort of, changed in American politics during the course of 2020, it's probably been overwhelmingly the COVID wave and the effects on the economy, and also the Black Lives Matter protests, and they're filtering through with if you to believe most polls, with general public sentiment towards them. At least before you get into the specifics, so obviously we can talk about that. But I think the Democrat Party and the Biden campaign has been, well, again, we'll see in a week or so, has been largely successful in utilizing the COVID chaos, in order to castigate the Trump regime. But they've also been, it seems, largely successful in using and subsuming, you might say, like the Black Lives Matter movement within it, at least temporarily, in at least election winningly, to at least project an image of useful, centrist liberal change.
Yeah, it's, I mean, and it's complicated because again, I talked about deprogramming, and again, this sort of comes back to the U.S. educational system, which I just think does not do a great job of being honest about how race, and how in particular the way we've historically treated Black and Indigenous peoples in this country. Incidentally, the two groups, per capita most murdered by police. That, we've just done a really lousy job. And as a result, even those who consider themselves sympathetic or on the left might look at these liberatory movements and say, oh, this is too extreme. But again, it comes from the same place that I did at one point, which is that my lack of good education on it, and the bubble that I lived in allowed me to believe certain myths about your ability to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and that we could exist in some kind of a meritocracy, which we could now prove, I think, pretty reasonably that is a total falsehood.
I see.
So so I think that there are still a fair number of Democrats who may consider themselves more moderate, who do sort of end up in this place of like what happened to George Floyd, a thing that, you know, that you're able to actually see. And for the record, I haven't watched it. Maybe I ought to. I don't think it's going to change my opinion on anything. It's, I am already sympathetic to Black Lives Matter, and I am beyond sympathetic to defunding and dismantling police forces as they currently exist, particularly given their history in the United States. So
I suppose the Biden campaign's like ultimate SOP or highest level SOP to Black Lives Matter in a weird way is the appointment of Kamala Harris as the vice presidential pick. You know, and Biden, once he emerged from the sort of the fire of the primaries, you know, he made it clear quite early on, didn't he, in it, that he was going to appoint not just a woman but also an African American woman or a woman of color to the role, and he has, and it's interesting, isn't it, because Kamala Harris is. We'll see how successful this ticket is, but she's far from a darling of the left, or at least as 2020 has played out, she's not become that.
No, and even, you know, early on, I liked her. You know, is my senator. You know, there were things to like about her, but in talking to a lot of my friends, they were basically like, she's a cop, and I was like, oh yeah, no, that's a good point. That's a good point. She, you know, and there were a lot of things that she didn't handle well. I think that obviously the situation is a lot more nuanced than that. I think that if you want to be an attorney general or a district attorney who is reform-minded, especially if you're a woman, I think that it's difficult. So I can understand on some level why she may have done things the way she did, you know. But if you do want somebody who, you know, if you're looking for purism, then those are all totally fair criticisms of her career. On the other hand, you know, like if you want to set up like a spectrum of attorneys general, you know, she's hardly the worst.
I don't often nail my colours to the mast in terms of, I mean, British politics even, but especially not American politics. But I think if I was a Democratic primary voter earlier this year, I probably would have been, for slightly different reasons, I probably would have been torn a little bit between Kamala Harris and Bernie Sanders as a presidential candidate. I wanted to briefly mention that to you because, of course, you Joe Biden was not your favoured candidate during the Democratic primaries, was he?
No, he ranked just above Tulsi Gabbard as far as I was concerned.
Just above the Zodiac killer. Yeah. I miss the Zodiac killer memes.
Oh, we all do. We all do.
How do you feel now about the fact that Elizabeth, because your favoured candidate in the primaries was largely Elizabeth Warren, wasn't it? Yeah,
I loved her, and what I was most actually frustrated with was the number of people I talked to, because I did support her, and I had some of my diehard Bernie friends were basically, you know, like, well, she's still a capitalist, and she's just, you know, draining, she's a spoiler for the Bernie vote, blah, blah, blah. But, you know, if you actually look at the math, it's 100% untrue. Even if every single Elizabeth Warren vote went to Bernie Sanders, my understanding is that, for all the electors that she got, it still would not have been enough to push Bernie over the finish line versus Joe Biden. And it looks like, you know, the party did not put their thumb on the scale as obviously as they did for Hillary Clinton.
Well, only in the sense of deal making, you know, I mean, like, you know, pretty overt deal making between Buttigieg and people like, you know, and Biden, for example.
Like Buttigieg and Klobuchar. Actually, I have sincerely enjoyed that Mayor Pete has become this just like this friendly, folksy weapon that just gets deployed to Fox News.
Right, yeah.
He's pretty incredible for that, and of course, I'm just like, okay, like, what's he positioning himself for? What is the Biden campaign going to tap him for?
Of course, Sanders has largely been playing ball as well in that sense, hasn't he? You know, he's been as far as, unless I've missed something, he's been largely supportively kind of tweeting nice things about the Biden-Harris campaign, and, you know, being generally encouraging. Obviously, I'm sure he's trying to, you know, don't get me wrong, I'm sure he's very aware that he's going to have to be vigilant in terms of promoting a left agenda after the election victory if it emerges. But, you know, they're holding together quite well at the moment, is what I mean.
Yeah, actually, it was during the first debate, for like the 15 minutes I was able to watch of that. That was another one where it's just so difficult. And it was so funny, I thought, because they were it took me a minute to actually figure out what they were talking about, because Trump was going on and on and on about a manifesto, and I found out he was talking about like the compromise platform that they developed between the left wing of the party and the more moderate wing of the party. And at the time, for a class, I'd just had to read Le Corbusier's Toward an Architecture, which is an actual manifesto. And I was just like, wow, these people have like no idea what manifestos actually are. But it occurred to me, it's like, it's got these like overtones of being like dangerous socialist communist. And for anybody who feels like manifestos are limited to just the left, I highly recommend the Futurist Manifesto, wherein a group of Italian artists and writers were highly favorable toward Italian imperialism in the late 19th, early 20th century. So yeah, not and of course Mein Kampf is also a manifesto. So, but they aren't all bad manifestos.
That's a good summary. I also, in summary, I just wanted to quickly ask you, I mean, this is again very hard at this historical moment to answer, because you've not seen how the story's ended yet, but do you, as a former Warren supporter in the primaries, do you think she would have made a more, or as it turns out, less effective candidate than Biden?
You know, I honestly think that this is a country that's just too sexist to elect a woman. And I think that, you know, one of the things I liked about her was that, you know, some of her policies may have been very high in the, very pie in the sky. But what I appreciated was that she was just churning them out like crazy. And I kind of, you know, and she's a former academic, which of course is something I'm going to be attracted to. But yeah, it comes down to the idea that this is somebody who is just really policy heavy, thinking about what can get done and how it can get done. And even if everything didn't 100%, you know, work out the way she thought it could, that doesn't change the fact that this was somebody who sort of showed up and was serious and was competent and still had these really exciting ideas. You know, again, I bristled anybody who said she was a spoiler for Bernie or that she was Bernie light, because, you know, as far as I'm concerned, she was her own human who had nothing to do with Bernie Sanders, except for where they both fell on the spectrum as far as Democrats went. But of course, Bernie still is not a Democrat. He is still an independent in the Senate.
Well, of course, after the election, when we actually get to do a proper post-mortem next time we chat, I will ask you again about quite a lot of these things, because obviously then we'll have real results to crunch
Emphasis
over.
on the mortem.
I just, in the time we have remaining, I just want to, I mean, you know, not on this earth, but on this podcast, I just want to...
I don't think either are very long.
I just want to throw it, because we'll talk about general predictions, you know, we'll cast our flags there, you know, but I just want to ask you a couple of like quite quick answer predictions based on states. So I'll throw a few states at you, and you tell me if you think they're going to flip blue or not. Just, you know, sort of mixture of gut feeling and you know, the best reading of the polls, etc. Texas.
Nope.
Yep, agreed. Florida.
Florida's a hard one. I mean, so I guess, you know, I would make so the guesses I'm going to make are assuming that there is no serious messing with ballots, which I'm not confident about. I think that there's some serious potential for abuse there. So I would say all other things if it's conducted fairly, Florida would go blue. I don't necessarily believe that it's going to be conducted fairly.
Yeah, I'd probably give the blue edge to Florida, but as I say, I've qualms about that as well. I agree with that.
If nothing else, I mean, look, they, you know, the fine people of the state of Florida decided, you know, that felons who had served their time should be given the right to vote, that they deserved suffrage because they had, you know, paid their debt to society, and then, you know, the Republican government, the judicial system there came in and said, yes, but actually no, you have to pay your fines. And it basically just comes to a poll tax, which is insane, and like I said, just sort of speaks to the deeply racist roots that still exist in this country.
Well, that the massive expansion of the franchise in Florida has. I'm actually surprised that's not had more mainstream media attention this year. But I guess it just shows what a busy year we've had. Basically.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So I would say that had things been conducted fairly, if if they hadn't tried to disenfranchise it's not even fair to call them felons because they served their time, but to sort of re-disenfranchise people who have repaid their debt to society is that's the kind of fuckery that I don't appreciate. But yeah, had they sort of followed the will of the people in Florida, I think that it would have been much clearer. But yeah, that's a really, and I don't know because I'm not clear that it's going to be conducted fairly.
What do you finally? Where do you see Pennsylvania going? Do you think that's going to tip blue?
I think that again, this is a situation where were it conducted fairly, Pennsylvania would tip blue just barely. But we've ended up with a situation where they are literally going to turn back ballots if you do not put them in 2 envelopes, and that was something that they were fighting here. Was that there's the envelope that you mail in and then a privacy envelope, and if you do not use both, your ballot is going to be rejected. That was something that they tried to fight in the courts, and the left lost on that, unfortunately. So like I said, if there's no messing around with the ballots, I think that it could go blue.
I suppose the only real remaining event that we have in this election that could still affect things is something that we probably already know the answer to, which is in 2 days from now, the Senate is expected to confirm Amy Coney Barrett as the new Supreme Court Justice.
Yep.
Do you think? I just had a quick question about that because I've been going back and forth on this a little bit. Do you think? Do you think the sort of transactional nature of some voters' support of the Republicans, you like the evangelical right, but also the moderate Christian right, of the Republican electorate, do you think that will make them, if that happens, do you think that makes them more or less likely to vote for Trump? Because do you think there's a certain amount of job done, we don't need him anymore, or do you think that's not how that works?
That's a good question. I couldn't honestly answer that because that's so outside of my social networks and my worldview that there's nobody that I personally encountered who could tell me either way if they were like, well, I'm just going to hold my nose and vote for him because I want to maintain this trajectory.
Because I remember when that came up, a month or so ago when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, I remember thinking, well, maybe arguably the smart thing for Trump to do now is actually delay, because then he makes himself the president. He makes himself the line to doing that,
Yeah, and that would be a good way to do it. But I think that probably the polling was already so poor that there's enough of a risk still that he could lose that I think that the Senate didn't want to risk that. Additionally, this could end up being another Bush v. Gore. I will say that there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that Biden will win the popular vote by a lot. And
it looks like it is all we can say at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by about 3 million votes, which is a lot. And I think, but it came down to given the Electoral College, it came down to 70-something thousand people.
So the last time the Republicans won the popular vote was 2004.
Yep, and
it's quite a long time ago now.
Yeah. And so I've absolutely no doubt that he'll win the popular vote considerably. But, we could well end up with another Bush v. Gore situation. And in that case, you definitely want 3 people that you appointed to be judging that.
Although it would be absolutely hilarious if it did come down to that, and then all the judges he'd appointed just voted against him. That would be. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but that would be an amusing outcome.
I found myself in a very uncomfortable position the other day. I was on Snopes just looking up something with regard to whether or not Amy Coney Barrett had actually said that using the N-word with a black person in a workplace, she basically is like, that alone is not enough to constitute a hostile workplace. And I'm like, but it turned out that that Justice Kavanaugh had also said that, yes, just using that word is enough to establish, even once is enough to establish a hostile workplace. And I was like, did I just agree with Brett Kavanaugh?
Well, a stop clock and all that,
I also like beer, so I guess there's 2 things we agree on.
Yeah, he's big on that. So finally, Tierney, because we've both got to go in a sec, but I just wanted to ask you, I think I've had hints of this already from the way you've been talking about some of these predictions, but what would you say your overall prediction, if you had to wager on it now at this stage, is?
I would guess, some people are saying that fighting it out in the courts seems unlikely. But I would guess, probably Joe Biden will win, but it's going to be an extremely excruciating and bloody November. It's gonna be awful no matter what, either with people fighting it out in the courts or people reacting in either direction. I will say that DC is only 8 hours from my home now, so if there are any serious protests or backlashes because of a Trump victory, if he does, he will barely eke by. It's not going to be a blowout by any means. I will be down there.
You're poised.
I am poised.
You've got the car running.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's one of the advantages of driving the extremely European car that I do, is that I get excellent gas mileage.
That's lovely of you to throw that in for us. Thank you. That's very, very, very charming. I think my prediction is probably actually quite similar to the one that we made back in the Game of Seats group. That I made back in that group back in was it about July? I think Biden's going to win, and I think he is going to win. Apparently, like as in on election night. But I think it's going to be closer.
Oh God, your lips to God's ears. Holy shit.
No, well. I mean, no. I mean, I do think it's going to be nail biting, and I do think I do have a lot of skepticism about Florida. But I think he's going to win, but I don't think it's going to be I don't think it's going to be a smash. Basically, some of the polls suggest a electoral landslide. I mean, even just akin to sort of Obama's victory in 2008, which was a relative landslide. Yeah. I don't think we're going to see that personally. And actually, you know what? When we do reconvene after the election, I'll talk a little bit more about what I think about Biden's deficiencies. Like, even if he wins genuinely, because we just didn't have time today, I'll talk a little bit more about why I think he was maybe not the best candidate. Obviously, I'll eat a lot of that if he does win, of course, as we all have to adapt to facts. But yeah, we can do that later.
All right. Yeah. I mean, let's hope so. It's like I think, like I told you, it's a little bit harder now to engage with it as like sort of a fun game, like once it was. Because it doesn't feel like it because it feels so consequential. And obviously previous presidential elections for the U.S. have been very consequential for a lot of people. For example, the entire Middle East. But but that's not to say though that it's for us who've been sort of like comfortably sitting here for so many years with our and this is again white upper middle class, etc., to be so comfortably sitting where the stakes were not that high. Now the stakes feel unbelievably high for everybody.
Well, I really hope the outcome goes your way, partly because of my own personal political preferences. But I really thank you so much for joining me, Tierney. This has been really enjoyable. It's felt a bit cathartic for me.
My pleasure. Let's hope that there's a little bit less mortem in the post-mortem than I secretly fear. Yeah.
Hold the mortem. That will be our instruction to our waiter.
There we go. All right. Thank you so much for having me.
Not at all. Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone listening to this. We'll see you again. Next time. Bye. You've been listening to the EscapeGoat podcast, hosted by David Blake Fagiani. If you want to contact the podcast with any feedback or thoughts, you can leave comments on our Libsyn page or under our YouTube videos, or email us at escapegoatpod@gmail.com. You can also reach the show on Twitter on @egoat_pod and follow us for new episode notifications, or get me personally on @dbfagiani. This podcast is available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts and Spotify, as well as our Libsyn site, escapegoatpodcast.libsyn.com. Original intro, outro, and any other incidental music for this podcast is composed, produced, and made available by permission of Richard Gilbert.